Hi, everybody. It's Alexander here, still out east and delighting in the aftermath of the big snowstorm that you got a few days ago, and we just wrapped up last night. So it's a winter wonderland here in New England. But as always, I'm thinking of all of you back in La Crosse, and I wanted to share yet another gorgeous musical masterpiece from our great classical music repertoire, now, of course, spanning hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's actually a deliciously difficult job as your music director to, from those hundreds and hundreds of great works, choose exactly the ones that I want to bring to you, my audience, whom I all love so much. I really do miss you a great deal, but we're going to be back together in March for another concert, another little concert that is going to spotlight the talents of our La Crosse Symphony string section. The final work on that program will be a very great work from the early 20th century, which we will get to later, I promise. But the middle work in the program will be another gorgeous opportunity to showcase the talents of members of our own La Crosse Symphony Orchestra as soloists. I'm referring to the Immortal Concerto for two violins in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, we started our season I'm so proud of our entire LSO organization that we've been able to soldier on with a season in safe, socially distanced conditions. You may remember the first of these concerts at the beginning of our season in October. We featured the E major solo violin concerto of J.S.Bach with our own concertmaster, our own wonderful Wes Luke. And this time we're going to be offering you one of the other of the three surviving J.S.Bach violin concertos. He undoubtedly wrote more, but these are the three that have been handed down to us for posterity. The so-called double concerto, the concerto for two violins in D minor. And this will feature not only our concertmaster, Wes Luke, but our also very, very gifted assistant concertmaster, Mr. Aaron Schwartz. It just occurred to me a few months ago that as much as I love this double concerto of Bach, as much as I've grown up with it since my teenage years, I've actually never had the opportunity to conduct it. And such is the life of a journeyman music director. You make lists in your mind. Oh, I've got to get to that piece. And it'd be so wonderful if we did, the such and such concerto by what's his name, and the audience would love it, and it'd be great for these players. And then just all these other competing needs and wants arise, and you keep inadvertently putting it off. And again, one has to glean all the blessings that one can from this difficult time we're all going through. And I'm just so thrilled to finally be able to preside over a performance of this immortal work. As I was saying, J.S. Bach left us three violin concertos. He probably wrote about a dozen. We certainly know of three other concertos that he wrote because he subsequently took separate movements from them and incorporated them as orchestral interludes in some of his great sacred cantatas. J.S. Bach, of course, was a devout and pious Lutheran, but he, I think rightly, did not hesitate to take a secular work, as it were, and adapt it for the purposes of a sacred work of music, or vice versa, like all the great Baroque composers. He was constantly and brilliantly borrowing from himself. But the three concertos that we know that he left to us directly, of course, are the A minor concerto for solo violin, the E major concerto with which we opened our season, and this double concerto in D minor for two violins. It's generally thought that Bach composed all of his concertos, as well as most of his great works for solo instruments, solo violin, sonatas, suites for solo cello, all those great suites and partitas for keyboard, harpsichord. It's generally thought that Bach wrote these works during his secular era, we often refer to it as, in between his various appointments at great Lutheran churches for Lutheran bishops in Germany, earlier before Köthen, he was in Weimar, and then afterwards, of course, most famously, he was the cantor of the great St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. In between, from 1717 to 1723, he worked for the Prince of Anhalt Köthen, this tiny little principality in Germany, which again, you must remember in the 18th century until the later 19th century, Germany was not a federal state, nor was it a kind of an empire, but it was this kind of hodgepodge, this constellation of little dukedoms and principalities that gradually formed into the Habsburg and then the German, Prussian empires. That's another story. But the 18th century in Germany was, again, it was part of this Holy Roman Empire, which stretched down to Italy, and it was this vast collection, this disparate, glorious hodgepodge of little princely states. And the Prince of Anhalt-Köthen was neither Roman Catholic, nor was he a Lutheran. He was a Calvinist, what we would now call a Presbyterian. And in those days, Calvinism was so severe that they frowned upon music in church, sacred music. So the Prince of Köthen allowed J.S.Bach to indulge kind of a pent-up, I think, desire to write also music in a secular mode. So it's from this era that we get, again, those sonatas and partitas we must never forget. It's from this era we get the Brandenburg Concertos, and also these 3 violin concertos, probably, and I say probably because when he, in 1723-24, when he moves to Leipzig to become, again, the cantor of the great St. Thomas Church with its extraordinary choir, which is still extraordinary to this day. Some of you may remember that it was only, I think now 3 years ago, that the choir of St. Thomas Church went on tour, and they actually toured our Cooley region. They did a concert down the road, as it were, at Luther College. So the choir is still going strong. And but J.S.Bach, who I think it could be definitely said had quite the work ethic, when he wasn't doing the vast number of duties that were part of being the director of music at the St. Thomas Church, in his vast amounts of spare time, he also directed from 1729 the Leipzig Collegium Musicum, this kind of secular community chamber orchestra, chamber music society. It's really the forerunner of our great municipal orchestras all over the United States. He also directed this Collegium Musicum, and it might have also been for the Leipzig Collegium Musicum that he wrote his 3 violin concertos. We'll probably never know, but they come from one or both of those 2 secular modes of his incredible career as a composer and executive musician. Like all of Johann Sebastian Bach's concertos, Bach proves, again, a complicated man, like all the great composers. Again, a devout Lutheran who saw nothing wrong with borrowing from his own sacred and secular works and repurposing them. J.S. Bach was definitely a Germanic man, but he was also a man, in his own way, he was a man of the world. I mean, it is astounding to us in this kind of postmodern world how people communicated in the days before the telephone, forget about the internet, but the way that people could, in that mode, be incredibly cosmopolitan. I would say, in the deeper sense, more cosmopolitan than we are today. I mean, it's often said that the modern world, the postmodern world, is this kind of barrage of all this information but very little knowledge. And I think with people like Bach in the 1700s, the opposite were true. So Bach, again, a proud German, but adored the music of the Italian Baroque, most especially that great Venetian composer who was just a little older, just preceded him by a few years, the great Venetian composer, the so-called Red Priest. Of course, I'm referring to Antonio Vivaldi, who most famously left us his collection of violin concertos known as the Four Seasons. However, like J.S. Bach, he was also an amazingly prolific composer, where if J.S. Bach, left the world hundreds of cantatas, mostly sacred, some secular, Vivaldi left the world hundreds and hundreds of concertos. And J.S. Bach rightly saw Vivaldi's concertos as the perfect model for the form. He actually went so far as to arrange Vivaldi concertos directly for other in other genres, for other musical instruments. Most famously, Bach took Vivaldi's very famous, I know we will do it at some point down the road in La Crosse, his very famous concerto for 4 violins, took it and note for note turned it into his own concerto for 4 harpsichords, which if you can fit 4 harpsichords or 4 pianos on a stage, it's a great opportunity, trust me, but it's just hard to do logistically. But Bach had this genius of taking a work by Vivaldi and turning it in, without any sense of plagiarism, just turning it into a work of his own. It was an act of tribute to Antonio Vivaldi, whose music he absolutely adored, almost worshipped, you might say. So Bach takes the Venetian Baroque concerto form as epitomized by Vivaldi. It's a work always in 3 movements, fast, slow, and fast. The central movement tends to be a cantilena, kind of an extended song. And the first and last movements, they're fast, and the first movement tends to be in like a square meter, if you will, like in 2 or in 4. And then the last movement is always a dance, like a jig, a gigue of some sort, which means it's either in 6/8, di-da-da-di-da-da, or in 12/8, di-da-da-di-da-da-di-da-da-di-da-da. So it's always this same basic form, but Bach pours into that. It's like, cast concrete. He pours into that form his own incredible, extraordinary ideas. Not only ideas, but his ability to develop those ideas. Someone in my summer chamber music festival, someone asked me, what makes classical music so special? And I said, what makes it special is that you not only have, as opposed to, say, popular music, you not only have a beautiful idea, but that idea then gets developed. And that's, of course, the genius of the classical music tradition, why I think we keep coming back to it, and it keeps casting this spell over us in many cases, for all of our lives. Bach's D minor double concerto is a perfect case in point. The central slow movement is this hauntingly beautiful cantilena that is a duet for the 2 solo violins, these 2 singing voices. Bach this is such a profoundly beautiful work that you almost, with all due respect, forget that the orchestra exists. You kind of forget that, like, the backup band is even on stage with you. The first and last movements are also in this standard Vivaldi form, and that the first movement in that square meter, da 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 dum 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 dum, is what we call a ritornello form, in which you get a basic idea, and then it keeps recurring, and in between the recurrences of that idea, which is for what we call tutti, for everyone playing, the soloists and the orchestra, then you have these episodes in which the soloists take the stage. The last movement, as I said, is this da-da-da-dee-da-da-da, this gigue-like dance in D minor, but it's a dance of a very serious nature. Over that, the real spark of genius of this work, and what I want you to listen for, is you not only have J.S. Bach writing a perfect Italian Baroque concerto in 3 perfect movements that do all the functions that you expect from that form, emulating the great master of Venice, Vivaldi, but Bach then, being the German composer, overlays that Italian gorgeous Italian form with the Germanic severity of the fugue. You know, a fugue is the form where you take one melodic idea and you introduce it in different voices, one after the other, taking the same notes but at different pitches. And if you listen carefully, all three movements of this D minor double concerto, while being in the perfect Baroque Italian style, each of those movements expresses its ideas in the fugal manner. One voice gets the idea, passed on to the next, and the next, and the next. So, you know, all of Bach's concertos, it goes without saying, are extraordinary, but this one is truly extraordinary. And if this is your first time experiencing it, boy, are you in for a treat. I've chosen for you one of the great historical performances, a performance that was recorded on television in the late 1950s in Paris. From Paris in 1958, that great American violinist and truly great humanitarian, man of all the world, who was always trying to use classical music as a way of bringing different peoples and different cultures together. Yehudi Menuhin shares the solo honors with the great Russian Soviet violinist of the era, David Oistrakh, two of the immortal violinists of the 20th century, from Paris in 1958, playing J.S. Bach's Double Concerto.